AMD's new Radeon RX 6400 and 6500 XT graphics cards didn't break any records for price to performance, but they did set a new low for cut corners. Thanks to their seriously nerfed PCI-Express connector, the only way to obtain the full bandwidth from these budget cards is with a pretty cutting-edge PC. For this build, I've set myself the challenge of putting together a fully PCIe Gen 4 compatible system to extract the maximum possible performance from these budget GPUs for the minimum price. The landscape for PCI-Express Gen 4 based systems can be something of a minefield. On the AMD front, most of their Ryzen CPUs from the last couple of years are fully compatible, but their APUs and some of their recently released CPUs are not. Even then, once you have the CPU, their cheaper A320 and B450 boards are still limited to PCIe 3. It's a lot easier to map out the situation with Intel. Their 11th and 12th gen Core series CPUs and corresponding motherboards all support PCIe Gen 4. Of the available options, I decided to build this PC around the B560 platform using an i5-11400 CPU at the centre. This 6-core 12-thread CPU is still available brand new. In the UK it costs around £160 or £130 for the F version, which omits the integrated graphics. I managed to find a non-F 11400 for $130 second hand, though 11400Fs can be had even cheaper on the used market. I picked up the non-F because I wanted to review the integrated UHD 730 graphics, video coming soon, but if you don't need the iGPU for Intel QuickSync acceleration or as a backup in the event your GPU should have a problem, you can potentially save £20 to £30 right there. You could also save money on the CPU cooler. My processor didn't include a stock heatsink, which is of course part of the drawback of buying used. However, I had this Be Quiet Pure Rock Slim left over from another project. After testing, I think this is overkill for the i5, but it is wonderfully quiet and can be picked up quite cheaply. The retail price is under £30, but can be picked up for £20 on sale or as an open box return. The B560 motherboard I picked up for this build is by Gigabyte and comes with 2 M.2 slots and 4 RAM slots. So although it lacks Wi-Fi, overclocking and VRM heatsinks, this is a pretty nicely specified board for the price. That price is usually £80 to £90 brand new, but I picked up an open box return for £60. If you don't happen to find a good deal on a B560, H510 boards will also support the CPU and PCIe Gen 4, but will be a little more bare bones. As an alternative build option, you could also consider swapping out the 11th gen CPU and motherboard for an entry-level 12th gen like an i3-12100F and H610 or B660. You might end up paying slightly more, especially on the motherboard, but you will get a more modern platform. With the current £200 GPUs, you won't see a performance benefit from a 12th gen CPU over an 11th, but that may change in the future. For RAM, I went with a pair of 8GB G.Skill Ripjaws V DDR4 3600 I had lying around from another project for a total of 16GB. 3600 speed RAM is overkill for this system, even more so if you went with an H510 that only supports up to DDR4 3200, but the price difference isn't that big. A good value 3200 kit should set you back between £50 and £60 new, and you'll only save a few pounds buying used. I usually recommend the value combination of a small SSD and large hard drive for low-cost systems. £70 should get you a 240 to 256GB SSD and a 2TB hard drive, but for this build I went a different route. I picked up an open box 1TB WD Blue NVMe SSD on eBay for £50, and they can commonly be had for £70 or less brand new. I decided aesthetics would be pretty important in this build. I plan to sell it on and it needs to stand out, so I've gone with a Techware Forge M2 case. This compact M80X tower features 3 ARGB fans that can be connected to the motherboard, assuming you picked up a compatible one, or controlled via a button on the case itself. And of course it has the now expected hinged tempered glass side panel for accessibility and mesh front for airflow. It generally costs about £50, which isn't the cheapest case out there, but in my experience, lower cost models often cut more corners. They have cheaper LED fans with fixed rainbow colours, or no option for motherboard control, so this is about as low as I'm likely to recommend going without sacrificing those creature comforts. That being said, the fans on this model are still powered by 4-pin Molex, so there's still room for improvement. Okay, I've been putting this off long enough. The AMD Radeon RX 6500 XT is about as controversial a graphics card as we've seen in 2022, and I'll address that controversy in its own video, which will be linked in the description when it's live. To sum up, the RX 6500 XT was launched at about £200, with performance that's roughly on par with every other £200 graphics card AMD's released in the last 6 years. Its critics have pointed out that not only does it not offer an improvement in performance, it also lacks features previously considered to be standard. It only supports 2 displays, doesn't have any onboard encoding for people who want to record their gameplay, and requires PCI-Express Gen 4 to access its full performance. As it stands though, this card has dropped in price since launch and is now potentially a very appealing option for less than £180. On the used market, you should be able to find them for £150 to £160, and there's quite a few out there, probably thanks to people reading reviews after they made the purchase. While the build montage plays, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the video sponsor, Nobody. Nobody is a non-corporeal corporation with no products or services to sell, 0 employees, and no marketing budget. Because being sponsored by Nobody kinda sucks, you could help support the channel with the usual YouTube things. Likes, comments, subscribing, etc. But if you wanted to help financially, you could give me a super thanks using the button near the like button down below. I also have a Patreon linked in the description, as well as some Amazon affiliate links if you were interested in buying anything I've talked about today. Buying this exact spec brand new would cost about £660. By skipping the fancy cooler, picking a cheaper motherboard and choosing the F version of the processor, you could get that down to about £600. I also had a look at the American version of PC Part Picker, and I think the low-cost option would set you back about $670. Having picked mine up as a mix of new, used and open box returns, I managed to spend a grand total of £540, including tax and shipping. With everything assembled, a Windows license provided by VIP SCD Key, and about a day and a half of downloading later, and I'm ready to start on the bench. The combination of i5 and 6500 XT is enough for perfectly smooth gameplay in Apex Legends. At 1080 resolution with high settings, the game averages just short of 90 FPS, with 1% lows of over 70. If you're looking for that 100 plus experience, or even 144Hz with the right monitor, you'll need to drop to low settings and maybe even use some resolution scaling, but this setup can definitely get you there. If you prefer Fortnite, this PC has you covered too. At 1080 low with epic view distance, this PC can manage a healthy 220 FPS on average, though I experienced some huge frame time spikes across the first few matches I played. By the third game things had improved so that 1% lows were in the 70s, but the first 2 games saw frame time spike almost constantly. My testing at high settings went a little better, with 1% lows staying above 60 for an average FPS just below 90. Fortnite performance can often be down to luck of the draw, and it's mostly not the GPU's faults. You'll probably know by now that of all the competitive shooters on the market right now, Valorant is the one that's least useful for benchmarking graphics cards, but most useful for testing CPUs. This processor is a low-key beast for Valorant and can drive over 300 FPS on average with lows of 170. Thanks to the graphics card, I'm doing that at 1080 high, though looking at the GPU utilization, it's possible there might even be room to jump up in resolution above 1080. If you're not into online shooters so much, Elden Ring makes for a decent test of this system. It does feature a 60 FPS cap that can only be avoided using a mod that needs to be run offline, so instead I chose the best preset the game can run at without dropping below the cap. High was a bit of a stretch too far, but medium works like a charm, only dipping occasionally from the 60 FPS mark. Red Dead Redemption 2 is another great fit for this build. Using the default balanced preset, the built-in benchmark returned an average of 66.1 and a minimum of 50.6. For some reason my old save in Valentine had vanished, so I basically started from scratch, but I don't have any reason to expect this system would struggle in any more intensive areas of the map. And while I'm talking about Rockstar, the game that will not die plays pretty well here. GTA 5 doesn't handle super high FPS very well, with 1080 high settings giving averages in the high 100s, and a frame time graph that's as spiky as a hospital monitor. You can get around this by turning on MSAA, or by simply turning up settings above high. I found that turning some advanced graphics settings on, as well as pushing other settings to very high, was still enough to stay above 60 FPS at minimum, and close to 90 FPS on average. So, with the success stories out of the way, I feel it's necessary to talk about some games that didn't do so well on this PC. When I tested the RX 6500 XT on my normal test rig recently, it scored an average of 33 FPS at 1080 medium in Cyberpunk. This was about 25% slower than the old RX 480, which was a card I expected this one to equal or beat most of the time. I put that performance down to the test system's PCI Gen 3 being a bottleneck, but this PC didn't see much of an improvement. Moving up from Gen 3 to Gen 4 saw about a 10% increase in averages, going from 33 FPS to 36. Final Fantasy VII Remake is another game I tested on the PCIe Gen 3 system recently. It's not a very benchmark-friendly title, as, without modding, it uses dynamic resolution scaling to maintain a constant frame rate where possible. It also seems to have its own internal logic for a frame rate cap. Although I specified a 120 FPS cap in the menu, the game rarely exceeded 60. On the Gen 3 system, the game experienced a lot of frame time spikes, resulting in a 1% low of 24 FPS. On this build, the average remains about the same, but the spikes are less frequent, and the lows were recorded at closer to 35 FPS. On another more positive note, the cutscene, which had given me significant trouble on the other PC, plays much more smoothly here. This video ended up taking about twice as long as it needed to, mostly because of this game. Guardians of the Galaxy has a built-in benchmark, and I've been critical of it in the past, as it's a lot less demanding than some of the early stages of the game. This time, things got weird. The benchmark was consistently inconsistent, with 1080 high sometimes scoring in the 30s, sometimes in the 40s, sometimes even as high as 60 FPS. Without changing a single setting, the game could give 3 different results in 3 runs, most of which were lower than I've seen on a lot of competing graphics cards. So rather than rely on the benchmark, I manually went through and tested the first level of the game. Given the experience I've had on other cards and what the built-in benchmark had led me to expect, this was actually fairly playable. At 1080 high, I recorded an average FPS of 43 and lows of 25. Control was another game that took longer to test than it should have done. Put simply, the game runs well enough at 1080 medium settings to give a roughly 60 FPS experience, with lows in the mid-40s. Pushing up to high means a significant drop into the 40s, and isn't really worth it in my opinion. Part of the reason for that is, the 6500 XT has a real issue with textures. In the opening scene, textures like the bureau seal on the floor, the US flags, the portraits, the wood, even Jesse's eyebrows and hair are all struggling to fully load up. I tried multiple reloads, multiple texture quality settings, usually to see either no change or the exact opposite result to what I'd expected. I did briefly swap cards to the RX 480, which didn't exhibit any of these problems at all, so I have to conclude it's something about the RX 6500 XT that's responsible. I tested Horizon Zero Dawn almost as an afterthought. I last used the game as a benchmark in my 2021 GPU test suite, and I thought it'll be a convenient reference point for comparing with cards I haven't tested this year. During my test run, the PC managed to stick close to 60 FPS most of the time at 1080 original settings, with 1% lows of 52 dragging the average down to 59 FPS. For comparison, last year's test of the GTX 1650 GDDR6 scored 52 FPS, and the 1650 Super managed 66 FPS. Both recorded lower 1% frame rates than this build, though that's down either to the quad-core CPU or hard drive I used in last year's tests. What I did notice while testing was the same low-quality texture issues as I saw in Control, usually in cutscenes. I'm beginning to think this is a bigger problem than I first thought. Finally, after all that disappointment, I thought it was best to end on a high note. Call of Duty Vanguard wasn't a catastrophe on the Gen 3 system, but it didn't impress me either. At 1080 medium, that platform saw only 82 FPS on average, with lows below 60. Compared to the 100 plus I saw on the RX 480, this was particularly disappointing. This Gen 4 build, however, sees the RX 6500 XT performing much closer to my expectations, averaging 100 FPS and only dropping about as low as 70. This build then has its pros and cons. I think the CPU is a definite high point, especially compared to some of the similarly priced AMD options. From what I hear, the i3-12100F could be a great alternative too, even though it only has 4 cores and 8 threads. For those of you interested exclusively in buying a PC from new parts, I think this build might be about as good as you can get for between £600 and £660. However, the graphics card is still proving to be a letdown, even in a system that is otherwise perfectly optimised for it. So I think I'd still recommend spending the extra £75 to £150 to step up to the next tier of graphics card. Of course, if you're willing to buy used components, you can get equal or better GPUs for the same price as this one, or even less. Keep an eye on the channel next week for more on that. In the meantime, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.